Hello, everybody. I'm Alexandre O.Philippe. I am a filmmaker. I guess I've been a filmmaker for almost a couple of decades now, and with my company Exhibit 8 Pictures. We are now working on our ninth and 10th feature documentary. Most of the films that we make are focused on essentially cinema and how cinema works and these sort of screen moments that have become essential viewing and that have become part of the global pop culture. Obviously, I'm a total film geek, so that's part of the reason why I have a tendency to make these films. We have a long history with BIFAN. I've actually been to the festival 8 times. BIFAN was the very first festival that ever invited my very first film back in 2003. And so as a result, it's my favorite festival in the whole wide world. And I'm very sad to not be there with you today in person, but very happy to be virtually. And the Fantastic Film School is a great platform, and I look forward very much to working with all of you and hearing about your exciting projects. So today we are going to talk about structure and intuition, which I think in a strange way are very, well, they're opposite, but they work together. And I'm going to try to sort of express that. And I do want to use one of our films, 2019 Memory, which premiered at Sundance, as a little bit of a case study. And then my wonderful partner, producer, Carrie Roy, we've been working together now for, my gosh, 15 years, will be joining me later on to talk a little bit about the sequence that I will be showing you. But we could be talking about structure for a very long time. We could be here for a whole weekend talking about structure. And so obviously there's no way that we can really do a deep dive into the importance of structure. But I do want to, think a little bit about this idea of pushing past these moments in our creative process where we feel lost. And structure obviously is I will certainly say something that is very important, that is in fact quite necessary to the process of storytelling and to the process of filmmaking. But intuition and learning to trust your intuition when things change, which is something that happens inevitably in the process of filmmaking, is also something that needs to be paid attention to, right? So I'm going to start talking about some fundamentals of structure and essentially hopefully give you a few little nuggets about how structure works, why structure matters, why we need to use it in the crafting of our stories. But I want to also impart to you guys this idea that structure is not a rigid thing. It's not something that is set in stone or trapped in amber. It is something that is malleable, that should be adapted to the work that you do, to the story, the very specific, particular story that you are trying to tell at this particular time. And, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about this idea that, most stories, most films have the same structure. We talk a lot about the 3-act structure. We talk a lot about the hero's journey. The fact is, if you start looking at and really looking at the great stories, these amazing movies that move you, that have blown you away, that have inspired you over the course of your career, you're going to realize that in fact, each and every one of those films has a very unique structure that in many ways cannot really be replicated. And what I'm trying to get at here is that there are fundamentals element of structure that we're going to talk about. But in my mind, there is no such thing really as a formula. And I hope that you can get those ideas out of your mind. So let's talk about the basic idea of structure and why do we need structure? Well, I think many of us can get caught up in this idea of quote unquote writer's block. You don't have the inspiration. You feel like you're hitting some roadblock somewhere along the way. A scene is not working. You thought you had it and it's just not going anywhere. Well, to me, writer's block is essentially a symptom of not having done the work that we need to do as writers and as storytellers to let the writing flow. And this usually means essentially that we have not quite figured out our dramatic structure. So without some kind of structure, it's really difficult, I think, to move forward in your process and to not give up. For me, there's nothing more heartbreaking than seeing filmmakers who start a movie and don't finish it, or start a script and don't finish it, or say, you know what, I've been working for 5 months on this thing, I'm going to put it aside and I'm going to move on to the next project. And then eventually I'll get back to this. But they never do, right? If you abandon something, chances are you're never going to want to get back to it. And I had a professor. I went to New York University in the dramatic writing program, and the greatest gift that I ever received, I think, as a writer, certainly, and eventually also as a filmmaker, was I was working on my thesis screenplay, and I was really struggling. I was essentially hitting a structural roadblock, and I went to talk to my advisor, and I said, "Look, I have too many problems with the screenplay, but there's this other great story that I can't wait to start working on. Can I switch my thesis to this other one?" And he said, no. He said, if you don't finish this screenplay, I will fail you. I will give you a failing grade in your class. And the real sort of miracle for me of that moment was that it forced me to address the problems. I had no choice. I was either going to fail the class or I was going to have to find a way to make this screenplay work. And I did. And it taught me, I think, the most valuable lesson that, when there's a story that you want to tell, there's a million ways that you can tell that story, but it is up to you to find a way to tell that story in the most compelling way. And it is up to you to figure out the kinks, to untie the knots, to solve the problems that are inevitably going to be part of the journey of telling that story. And until you figure those out, you're not going to be able to ever tell that story in the best possible way. But I think there should be tremendous amount of satisfaction in solving these problems, getting the job done, finishing, and releasing the film. And I think this is an important lesson, I think, for all filmmakers. That's how you become a filmmaker. You just make films, and you're not going to be 100% in the end ever completely happy with a film. There's always going to be things that you wish you had done differently, and that's okay. That's just part of the process. And you're going to have to get over that and move on and make the next film, hopefully, a better one. Okay, so taking a little step back here, before we get into sort of fundamentals of structure, I want to talk about story, right? There is no structure without a story. And how does essentially a story function? Well, I'd like for us to think about a story as essentially a series of events. Stories, whether they're fiction stories, whether they're nonfiction stories, I mean, obviously I mostly do nonfiction work, but we've also done some fiction shorts, but they work really in the same way. They have to keep us compelled, right? And so really one of the sort of fundamental questions that I think you need to ask yourself as you're crafting your story is, why do we keep watching a story? Which is really the same question as when you pick up a book and you start reading that book. What makes you keep turning the pages? Well, the answer to that is actually quite simple, is we want to know what happens next. So your job really as a storyteller is to provide that kind of, those questions. You have to keep that alive in the mind of your audience. You have to make them want to know what happens next. One way to look at story, and I always use this image because I think it's a compelling one to think about. If you imagine a still lake and you grab a pebble and you throw that pebble in the water, what happens? Ripples, right? You have this ripple effect. For me, this is sort of the way to think about a story. You throw the pebble in the water, something happens, right? It's what we call the inciting incident. It's an event that starts the action of the story. And the ripples are essentially this chain reaction of events that ensue, that follow that pebble being thrown into the water. So what's, I think, really sort of essential to understand is that story is not, you know, this happens and then this happens and then this happens. Story is this story event happens because this happened prior, and because this happens, this must happen. In other words, there is a very strong connection between story events, cause and effect, you know. And so, you know, this is really something that, as you're structuring your work, and we'll get to that in a minute, you know, you need to really think about that, you know, connection between story events. And if you can remove a story event, if you can remove a scene, if you can remove a sequence even completely from, you know, from your screenplay or from your film, then I think the question becomes, what is it doing there? What's the purpose of that scene? Do I need it? If removing that scene does not have any effect on the rest of the film. So this particular chain reaction of events, that is essentially what a story does, is triggered by questions. But more specifically, it is triggered by what we call the major dramatic question. Every story, you know, hopefully quickly, will introduce a number of questions, right? Again, the reason why we want to keep turning the pages in the book, and the reason why we want to keep watching a movie, is because we want to know what happens, right? But there usually is one question that drives the action of the film. And that question usually is introduced in the mind of the audience pretty early on in that process. I'm going to give you a few examples. Will Brody kill the shark? Okay, that is the major dramatic question in Jaws, right? The moment that the shark has been introduced, that is the major story problem. And until we have the resolution to that question, will Brody kill the shark, we are 100% compelled and riveted in Jaws from beginning until the end. Of course, the moment the question is resolved, it's time to wrap up the film, right? It's time to move on and roll the credits. And that's the thing to really understand, is this idea that once the major dramatic question has been resolved, there's really two things you can do. You can either end the film or introduce another question that is greater than, that is more compelling than, that is in fact surprising, and you know, possibly even subverts that initial major dramatic question. But you know, if we as an audience are, you know, compelled and interested to know the resolution to that question, you know, there's only so many places that you can go at that point. And there's nothing worse than resolutions that go on, you know, and on and on and on once that question has been resolved. The question, will the lovers end up together? I mean, that is the major dramatic question in every single romantic drama, romantic comedy ever made. I mean, that's really the central question of that particular genre. For those of you classic, you know, film lovers out there, what is Rosebud? That is the major dramatic question in Citizen Kane, the great classic film by Orson Welles. If you haven't watched the film, watch it. It's amazing. It's an amazing piece of work. And I'm not going to tell you, of course, what Rosebud is, because you have to watch the film. A couple more. Who killed Laura Palmer? I mean, that's an interesting one. If you guys have seen Twin Peaks, David Lynch, that is the question that drives the action of the first season of the film. Without giving you guys spoilers, that is a question that actually gets resolved by the end of the first season. And interestingly enough, because it is not replaced by a stronger or more compelling question in the second season all of a sudden becomes unfocused. It's really fascinating to me to see how, these, questions and the drive behind those questions is really the reason why we're so compelled in watching those great films or series or whatever material you're watching. And when those questions disappear, again, the question is, what is going to keep us compelled at that point? Great Korean film, Parasite, which of course won just about every award around the world, rightfully so. The question, again, very simple: will the Kim family take over the wealthy Park family? And that is what compels us to keep watching that particular film. I'm going to give you another one, which I think is really interesting as well. If you guys are fans of theater, Hamlet, William Shakespeare, will Hamlet kill Claudius and avenge his father's death? What's really fascinating about this is that motivation, that major, the main storyline essentially of Hamlet is introduced in the first scene, and that is the question that we want to see resolved. But if you think about those plays, you think about actually, Shakespeare used to work in 5-act structure, so they're very complex. There's a lot of characters, there's a lot of subplots, there's a lot going on. There's a gazillion themes. It's very intense stuff. But yet, there is this one question that drives the action of a 4.5-hour play. Will Hamlet kill Claudius and avenge his father's death? That to me is a real sort of lesson that when the question is compelling enough and powerful enough and introduced, in that very first scene in this particular way, you are hooked. And of course, the work of a great filmmaker, the work of a great playwright, the work of a great screenwriter is going to be to layer all of those other characters and subplots. And that's the real, there's a lot of art to that. But at the end of the day, even Shakespeare would root his work in a very simple storyline and a very compelling question to answer. And I think that's why his plays, centuries later, remain as powerful and as popular as they are now. So there is something to be said, and look, there's a gazillion ways, again, to sort of think about how to structure your work, from a simple 3-act structure to a 5-act structure to an alternative structure to a movie like Memento. You can mess with time. There's all kinds of stuff that you do. But there is something to be said about simplicity. And that's something that I learned from being fortunate enough to spend a lot of time with William Friedkin, working on our previous film, Leap of Faith. For him, making The Exorcist, he wanted to make, as he said, a simple story told in the most straightforward way without any flashbacks. And I think that's one of those reasons that, The Exorcist remains one of the most popular films of all time. But to successfully execute a story, you really need focus, you need clarity, you need purpose, and you need to essentially give the audience what I would call promise. Any audience will have certain expectations. When you're going to the movie theater and you're sitting down to watch something, usually you've seen the trailer, You're expecting the movie to deliver something, some kind of experience. Well, that's the promise of the filmmaker. If you are making a romantic comedy, the expectation that the audience is going to have is that no matter what happens in the film, no matter who the lovers are and what they're going through, by the end of it, they're going to end up together. If they die, like in Romeo and Juliet, what you have is a tragedy. So, those expectations have to be met. And sometimes, of course, if you're, very clever at what you do, you're going to be able to subvert or exceed those expectations. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples in a minute. So in order to deliver on that promise, and this is where we're starting to get into important stuff here. What you need is a premise. So premise versus promise, promise. And you need to sort of understand the relationship between premise and plot. So let me give you my own sort of personal definition of premise. I will say that the premise of a film, the premise of a story, the premise of a book is the writer's argument as it relates to what we call the controlling idea. The controlling idea is essentially the main theme in a film. So controlling idea can be love, right? There's many, many films about love, right? There's many films that explore the idea of love. But a premise would be great love defies even death. And that is the premise of Romeo and Juliet. So it's essentially a theory that you, the writer, intend to prove. It's your inner truth, if that's one way to look at it. It is what you're trying to express over the course of your film, over the course of the story. And the difference between a filmmaker and a lecturer is that we can be talking about concepts and ideas. We can be talking about love. I could be making a lecture here about love, and we could be having this conversation about the concept of love and what it means. But what a film does is that it takes this idea and it expresses it and it turns it into a story that is felt, so that your premise essentially hits home by the end of the film. So, one thing I would say is that storytelling really is the creative demonstration of truth. It is, and structure is the means by which you first express and then prove your idea or your premise through dramatization. In other words, structure is here to help you express your premise. Let me give you a couple of examples here. So The Wizard of Oz, which we're working on a film right now by The Wizard of Oz. So I love that film. I don't know that film is necessarily as popular in Korea necessarily, but there's something that you guys should, if you haven't watched it, you should watch it. It's a terrific, terrific film. In fact, it's not big in Europe. I waited about 25 years, I think, to watch it for the first time. Everybody in the United States has actually seen that film as a kid. I did not. So I came into The Wizard of Oz as an adult and instantly, fell in love with that movie. But to give you a real sense of brief sense of The Wizard of Oz, we have a little girl. Her name is Dorothy, and she lives in Kansas with her aunt and uncle, and her little dog Toto, who is threatened by this mean woman called Elmira Gulch, and she is essentially unhappy at home, and with her dog being threatened, she wants to leave. So she has this famous song where she wants to go over the rainbow, which is this sort of great. And by the way, that's a moment that has been mimicked by George Lucas in Star Wars. That great moment on Tatooine with Luke Skywalker and the two suns, of Tatooine. That is a direct reference to the great, over the rainbow moment in The Wizard of Oz. But so this idea of wanting to go over the rainbow, that's her story goal, and and so initially, really during the first act of the film, the question becomes: will she want to escape? Will she manage to escape? Will she manage to go over the rainbow? Well, when she gets there, and she does, she lands in this land of Oz, which we'll never quite know if she really went there or if it's in her imagination. Well, it turns out that life in Oz is not as wonderful as it's cracked up to be. There's a very mean, wicked witch, who lives there, and eventually she has to go see the wizard, and the wizard tells her that she has to go get the witch's broomstick in order to essentially leave Oz and get back home. So the story essentially reverts to a completely different story goal, which is to get back home. So really the major dramatic question at that point becomes, will Dorothy get back home? Very simple. Again, very, very simple. So the controlling idea of the Wizard of Oz is home. And not just home in a physical sense, but home, of course, and also in an emotional sense. The premise that the Wizard of Oz tries to express is there's no place like home. Now, that line is actually expressed and is said numerous times in the film itself. But if you think about it, and I think about the way that the Wizard of Oz is structured, is how do we express this idea? How do we express this premise that there's no place like home? Well, how about we pick this girl and we're going to give her the exact opposite goal, right? And that goal is going to be, she wants to go over the rainbow. We're going to grant her her wish. We're going to take her over the rainbow. And by going over the rainbow, she's going to realize that, in fact, there is no place like home. What a great and smart way, by the way, to structure a film, because you're also giving that movie now a tremendous dramatic movement. You're going in the opposite direction initially of where you want to take your audience in the premise. But by taking them far away, you're making them realize how important this idea of home actually is, so that by the end of the film, you get it emotionally. And that is what a great story does. Now, if you look at movies, and I'm just going to use a couple of examples here from Hitchcock, because I'm a huge Hitchcock fan, in case you haven't figured that out, because obviously we made this film called 1752, which is a whole feature about the psycho shower scene. The Birds is really tricky. Now we're getting into, it's almost like magic trick filmmaking. It's an alternate kind of storytelling, because if you ask me what is the premise of The Birds, I'm not really sure that there's an answer to that, because The Birds, gives you essentially a love story, and it's a strange love story. They're strange characters, but you get really involved in that storyline for a while, and then all of a sudden, birds start attacking for no good reason. It's never explained why. There's a lot of speculation. It's never resolved by the end. You have no idea what the hell is going on in The Birds. But the fact is that this idea that they're suddenly attacking in the middle of a story that you're following, that is exactly what Hitchcock wanted to do. He wanted to sort of pull the rug from beneath our feet and completely freak us out. So yeah, of course, there are themes. There's themes of love, of courage. I would probably argue and say that there's no moral to The Birds. There's obviously a very strong concept to The Birds, but this removal of the story premise, and therefore, in fact, the removal, quite frankly, of the plot itself, is what Hitchcock was after. But you can't make a movie like The Birds until you understand what audiences' expectations are, what sort of basic, how audiences react to a story by being given a major dramatic question and having certain expectations. You can't subvert expectations until or unless you understand how to fulfill those expectations in the first place. He did it, of course, with Psycho as well, right? I mean, you get quite involved in the story of Marion Crane. This is a wonderfully well-developed character who steals $40,000 to be with the man she loves, and who does something essentially completely out of character for her. And so that's riveting in and of itself. She even makes the decision at some point when she's at the Bates Motel and she realizes she's gone too far. She realizes that she's in trouble. She's going to, return that money. She's going to go back home, return the money, and essentially face the music, face the consequences. And Hitchcock basically goes, no, you don't get to do that. You're going to die in the shower. I mean, what a horrible thing to do. I mean, think about the moral universe of that film is really messed up in a way. But what this does is it's almost like a direct attack on us, the audience. It's like, you had these expectations. You thought that I was going to give you a resolution on this character of Marion Crane. No, I'm not. I'm going to kill her. And now you're going to be left alone at the Bates Motel with this weird dude and his mother. And you're going to be trapped there. And you're all alone. This feeling of being essentially completely detached, removed, forcefully removed from your protagonist is one that audiences were not used to at the time. I don't think audiences are still really used to that. I mean, the way to get into a story is through the characters. Whether it's a single protagonist, whether it's a body story, whether it's an ensemble piece, there are usually characters that we tend to connect with. And these characters are here to help us navigate through the world of the story. And most audiences still today expect that. So it's funny, by the way, that Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead have been very successful at doing this, sort of shockingly killing characters at points in the film where you don't expect them to die. And audiences were so upset, in many ways, rightfully so, at what was going on, But the funny thing to me is that, those are very recent shows. And, we get shocked by this, we get shocked by Game of Thrones, we get shocked by, The Walking Dead. But then we have to think, wait a minute, Alfred Hitchcock did that in 1960. That was a long time ago. So it's kind of, those are techniques that are still, I think, very much working today. Okay, so once you understand, once you've thought about those sort of basic elements of how you're going to get your audience to keep watching the film, what is your concept, what is your premise, what are the things that you're trying to express through the world of your story, I will say that the simplest way to come up with a basic structure of your film is to ask yourself a simple question: how does my story end? Because that's how you deliver your promise. It's like, imagine this, right? If I'm a bus driver and we're in Bujan, and you guys get in the bus, and the bus says that I'm going to take you to Incheon Airport, right? Your expectation is that I'm going to take you there, right? if I don't get you there, if we don't end up at Incheon Airport, you're going to get probably not happy. You're going to ask for your money back, right? So, this, but I may not take the fastest road to take you there. I may actually meander around. I may take some turns and take you around some twists, and that's part of what makes a story fun. That's what makes a journey fun. And I think that's one way to look at a story, is that essentially it is a journey. But there is always going to be this expectation. There is always going to be this promise that you're giving the audience. And so when you're clear on where you're going to take them, what is the destination of the piece, what is the emotional high moment of the arc of your narrative, it's much easier now to think in terms of how you go from point A to point Z. And I don't care if you have a 1-act structure, 2-act, 3-act, 5-act, 9-act, 11 acts. A movie like Speed, actually, really fun action movie, has 11 acts. It's an 11-act structure. But it doesn't really matter. It's not about how many acts. It's not about whether it's conventional or non-conventional. It's how do you get to that point Z? How do you get to that crisis, climax, and resolution in a compelling way? So one way to look at it is figure out your ending. And your ending, remember this, is going to resonate with your premise. Let's think again about The Wizard of Oz, right? There is no place like home. She gets back home in the end. And boy, does it feel good, right? This feeling of being home, of having gone over the rainbow, worked hard to get back and to be surrounded by her family and friends again. That is the emotional high of the film, and it is completely earned by the story that is delivered. So that's really our job. And so when you figure out that final scene and how it gets there, then as a writer, as a filmmaker, all you need to do, and I say this because it's not that simple, right? We all know this, but all you need to do is figure out how to get to that end. If you have a goal, if you have a point in the distance towards which you're going, let's figure out how we're going to get there. And how we get there is with story events. We talked about the inciting incident. Well, there's these other story events that we call plot points. They're major turning points in the film, right? So for instance, Dorothy landing in Oz, actually physically landing in Oz, that's what we call a plot point. It's a major story event. It's a point of no return. That's always really, really compelling, by the way, whenever characters go through something, they cross a threshold, they enter a world, they, take a red pill or a blue pill, they do something that propels them to a different world, a different dimension, through a door, whatever it may be, and they can't go back, they have to move forward, right? So think about not just your plot points, and again, forget about this idea of how many acts. Think of it in terms of major story events. And so if you can map this out, if you say, okay, this is my inciting incident, and this is my, climax. Map out, the 3, 5, 10 main story events that are going to lead you from point A to point Z, right? So you got A, B, C, D, E, blah, 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 all the way to Z. And once you figure that out, it's actually pretty simple. Because if you know that you can go from A to B, and that once you've reached B, it makes logical sense for you to go from B to C and from C to D and so on and so forth. Then when you're working on crafting your screenplay, all you need to do is focus on one sequence at a time, one scene at a time. From A to B, I'm going to focus on my first scene, right? And that's what I want to get from here to here. And I know that when I get to B, I'll be able to move on to the next part of my screenplay. What this does is it completely frees you to think about the piece as a whole. I think there are very few writers who can constantly think about the structural world of their piece as one whole. It's overwhelming. There's so many moving pieces, so many characters, so much going on. I mean, if you're working on a series or if you're working on an epic movie, how do you even wrap your head around that? I think there's very few writers who can do that. But what you can do is focus on one scene, one sequence at a time. And structure in that sense is your friend. Structure is actually here to help you. Okay, so in a minute, I'm gonna talk a little bit about two of our films, 1752, which is the one about Psycho, and Memory, the film about Ridley Scott's Alien that we made a few years ago. But before I do, I want to leave you in terms of structure with my favorite definition, which is by Robert McKee, who, by the way, wrote a great book called Story. I highly recommend that you read it if you can find it. And this is the way that he defines structure. He says structure is a selection of events from the character's life stories that is composed into a strategic sequence to arouse specific emotions and to express a specific view of life. So, the key words here for me, I mean, there's a few, right? This idea of selection of events, I think, is really important. This idea that, I think what it implies here is design, right? As I've said earlier, the world of a story is not a bunch of random story events having no connection to each other. They are actually connected, and they're connected in a very powerful way. So selection of events from the character's life stories that is composed, right? Think about going back to this word of intent. It's composed. It's not just slapped together. It is composed into a strategic sequence, meaning that you're playing a kind of chess game with the audience. You're holding the strings, right? As I said earlier, you're the one driving the bus. You're going to take the audience on that journey, but you're going to take them there in a way that they don't really expect. And that's going to be the payoff, right? You're in control. You're always in control. And that's the difficult thing, is that if your film fails, if your audience does not connect with the film, you are the one who is at fault. That's the sad thing to say, right? And that's why it's so difficult to tell stories and to make movies. So selection of events from the character's life stories that is composed into a strategic sequence. And here it is, to arouse specific emotions and to express a specific view of life, right? He actually repeats the word specific twice, which again goes, for me, that's the lesson here, is that there is a real sort of purpose behind any good story, right? So in other words, stories are about purpose, they're about intent, they're about design. And your structure is here to articulate your premise. So I'm going to tell you a little bit, before I talk about Memory, I have to tell you a little bit about 1752, because there's a connection between the two. And it's going to give you a little sense of how I personally approach my work. So the case that, when I started, again, there's a million ways that you can approach a film about Psycho or a film about the shower scene. Just like, if I gave you guys the assignment to make a movie about any historical figure, you would each come up with a completely different screenplay and make the film in a completely different way, because we all interpret, story events, historical events, characters, things that we see in a different way. We all want to express different things, and so therefore, each and every one of you would make a different film. And I think that's the beauty of art. So when I wanted to make 1752, I wanted to make the case that the shower scene in Psycho, 60 years later, remains the most significant scene in the history of cinema, and that it still contained many secrets. That's what I intended to prove. Remember, that's what I was talking about earlier. That's the idea of, expressing a premise through story structure. So the design of the film was to, number one, I wanted to establish the cultural, the social, and historical significance of the scene. That's number one. Number two, analyze the scene from a technical standpoint with some of our greatest and most respected filmmakers and Hitchcock experts. So people from Guillermo del Toro to Walter Murch and Jamie Lee Curtis, we can go on and on. And three, reveal those secrets to make my point. So the question to myself was, okay, how, if that's what I want to deliver to the audience, how do I achieve this structurally? Well, okay, how is Psycho structured? Well, if you think about it, Psycho really is, in many ways, you could look at it as a two-act structure. I mean, the first half of the film takes you in a certain direction, and then the shower scene hits, and you go in a completely different direction as well. But there is a lot of foreshadowing. There's a lot of elements of suspense, very subtle suspense, that Hitchcock introduces in the film that lead you ultimately to the shock of the shower scene. And so I started thinking about this idea of, well, what is the expectation of a film about the shower scene? Well, the expectation is that you're going to get to the shower scene itself. That eventually, this will be, that iconic scene will be deconstructed. So what I did is I used essentially what I call a mirroring structure. The first act explores the scene, within its sort of social, cultural, historical context, while playing on the audience's expectations that we will get to the scene. If we don't get to the shower scene in a film about the shower scene, then obviously I'm not delivering on those expectations, right? And so, and halfway through the film, or actually for about 45, 42 minutes into 7852, which is roughly the same time code as, when the shower scene hits in Psycho, we get into it, we get in the shower, and the second act deconstructs the scene. So that deconstruction now resonates specifically because of Act One, because we have provided the context of history and culture. And so the deconstruction isn't just a dry deconstruction of a 2-minute scene. It's a deconstruction, a shot-by-shot deconstruction in context. So on the story level, I wanted to also create instant anticipation. And I started thinking about, well, how do we do this? So we devised an opening sequence that the idea was, because the movie is introduced by the body double, the actual body double who was in Hitchcock's shower, to take the audience on a journey to the Bates Motel, where each of our interview subjects is essentially trapped in their own room watching Psycho, and we're watching them watch Psycho at the same time. So it's playing on this idea of voyeurism. So we devised a pretty complex opening sequence, which I'm not going to show you today, but you can find it probably easily if you get the film. I believe it's on Netflix in Korea. And in that way, hooking the audience and leading them to the Bates Motel, getting them trapped there, which is the feeling that we have when we watch Psycho, and not let them off the hook until the very end of the film. So when we approached Memory, which is a film about Alien, initially, and this is where intuition comes into the picture. Initially, I became very interested in looking at the infamous chest burster scene, which I know you're all genre filmmakers, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. I wanted to see if that scene had the impact that it had for the same reasons as the psycho shower scene. And look, I'll be the first one to say, I think I became a little bit lazy. I wanted to approach that scene in the same way as the psycho shower scene. You know, I would ask myself essentially, did it resonate with audiences for the same reason? Was it as culturally significant a moment as the psycho shower scene? But so we shot a bunch of interviews. We even put together, 5-minute sizzle, and it just didn't work. It didn't work. It felt flat to me, and it felt like it just didn't have the energy of 1752, and I felt like I was going in the wrong direction. And so I started thinking about why that was. And it occurred to me that even though those two scenes are very similar in many ways, they both happen roughly at the same point in the film. They're both completely shocking. You don't see them coming. They both happen in a safe, brightly lit spot. I mean, technically speaking, they're very similar, but they resonated with audiences for completely different reasons. And I came to a point where I don't know that I was ready to abandon the film, but I was getting pretty bummed out, and I was, not sure where the film would go. But there was this one little story, this one little nugget, this one little thing that I just couldn't get out of my head. And that is that when Ridley Scott started having these conversations with H.R. Giger, the great Swiss artist who won an Oscar, of course, for Alien, about the design of the chest burster, he showed him this extraordinary triptych by Francis Bacon, the British artist. A triptych that, just like the chest burster, erupted in 1944 on the art scene and completely changed the art world. And it is called 3 Studies for Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion. It's a long title. But it's these 3 monstrous, strange-looking figures that turned out to be mythological figures. Francis Bacon was haunted by the furies of Greek mythology. And I thought, you know what? I want to go down that path. I want to see where that leads me, because I'm interested about this. Not that in this idea that there's a conscious connection between Alien and Greek mythology, but I'm interested in this idea that there might be an unconscious connection between the two. And the moment that I opened that door, everything started lining up, everything started happening. And in fact, the film Memory makes the argument that Alien connected with audiences on an unconscious way, and that Alien is much more a film about our ancient past than it is a film about our distant future. And it's a film that was dealing with fears that were felt, and a guilt that what I refer to in the film as, patriarchal guilt, which is still very much in our society today, obviously. But it's at least it's something that we're starting to talk about now. We're 40 years later. 40 years ago, we were not talking about those ideas. They were completely repressed, but they were there. And so therefore, when the chest burster erupted onto the screen, it's all that unconscious stuff that people felt while they were watching the film. And so the film radically changed. And, we ended up meeting Diane O'Bannon, the wife of the great late Dan O'Bannon, who of course wrote Alien. And Carrie and I, went to see her, and she, gave us access to Dan's archives, a lot of stuff in the film that, I'd never been seen before, not by the most hardcore of Alien fans. And the film essentially became this whole new thing. When that happens, I mean, there's really two things you can do. One is you put your foot down and you say, no, sorry, movie, I'm the writer, I'm the filmmaker, you're going to bend to my will. I don't think that's ever a good idea to do that. Um, or you can just be open to this new possibility. And truly that is when the magic happens. And I think, well, we're going to show you the scene in a minute, and then we're going to bring in Carrie. I want to hear her perspective on that, because I know that was a very difficult scene to make, and it was a very expensive scene to make. But everything happened very quickly from that point forward. We worked like I felt like it was like being in a fever, for 9 months. So when that happens, you have to completely reinvent your premise, your story structure, your intent, what it is that you're trying to convey, all of that stuff. Everything goes out the door. And it's a very scary moment. It's a very scary thing when you're a filmmaker to say, I have to completely reinvent this thing that I've been working on now for a long time. But if you can trust that, and if you can use that craft of storytelling and structuring to your advantage when this happens, and if you pay attention to what your story wants to be, because I really believe in this idea. I really believe that stories eventually take on a life of their own and they want to be something. And it's your job as a filmmaker to give them the opportunity to become this thing that they want to do, and to pay attention and to listen to them and to structure them accordingly. Okay, without further ado, we're now going to watch the opening scene, or the opening sequence, sorry, of Memory. And now I am joined by the wonderful Carrie Roy, my partner in crime. Hey, Carrie. So, I've just talked my head off here, but I'm really interested to hear and about that scene from your perspective and the challenges that we faced when essentially all of a sudden we had a new film on our hands.
Well, I was listening. I learned a lot just now, and I was thinking about you were talking about the twists in the story, right? And how things change when you open a certain door and go through a specific portal. And I feel like our process, generally speaking, and this one in particular, really mirrors that, because that's what happens when you're working, and then the idea happens and we go down a different road. So for this scene, in particular, we as you mentioned, had thought that we might be approaching memory in a similar way to 7852, with an opening scene that has kind of a cinematic narrative shooting style. And so we had put some thought into that and had some numbers in the budget available. But then this became a trip to Greece and to Italy, and a set, the spaceship set in Los Angeles. So it became a little bit bigger, and I think part of the way we work together, and I think that I try to support your creative ideas, is that we start with a plan, and then sometimes the plan gets shifted and molds a little bit. And so we have to, my job, as I see it in that case, is to fix it, right? How where do we pull numbers from? How do we get to Greece, and how do we film in Delphi, and how do we get those permits, and who in Italy is going to help us read those contracts and and get those things set up and get the equipment over, and all of those details um, have to come from a different place in our original plan. So I guess that's a long way around saying the short answer is I have to problem solve that, and we work together. And part of that is compromise. So as there are changes and compromises, happening in terms of how the story is approached, I think that the production side of it has to mirror that.
Yeah, yeah, and something, I mean, similar obviously happened to us also with, Leap of Faith, which is a film that we did on The Exorcist, and one thing I was not expecting, and I think this, I mean, I think it's really important to say this does not just happen in nonfiction; it happens in fiction. Things are going to happen in the making of your film that are going to be, well, you can call them accidents. Friedkin would call them gifts from the movie gods, which is the way that I like to sort of view it. But in this particular case, I did not know that on day 4 of our interview process, he was going to start talking about the Zen gardens in Kyoto, and with tears in his eyes, and it's the most beautiful moment. And I knew on the spot that, first of all, I mean, I remember as he was delivering that monologue, I thought, this is the end of the film. And then number 2, we have to go to Kyoto, right? Well, obviously, we did not budget Kyoto. so that's it's just one of those things that intuition can be a real problem sometimes, but it's also, I think intuition comes with a certain sort of evidence that there are things, there are miracles, there are things that happen in the filmmaking process, no matter what you're working on, that are, as I said, they're gifts. And when you have them, sometimes you go, oh, I can't, I don't have the means to do something with this, but we're gonna have to find a way. And I think for me, filmmaking is that. I mean, the infuriating and the beautiful thing about filmmaking is you have to find a way against all odds, no matter what. right?
No, I agree. It's definitely, it's all about plan B. I know that there, it really is about plan B,
Yeah.
because plan A, and usually plan C, D, E, or F come into play as well,
Yeah.
which I'll talk about when I do my class later. But yeah, it's really about flexibility. And I think that one of the things that we've been doing this a long time, 14,
Yeah.
15 years. And so we have our own language, right? Where there's push and pull, and there's, how do we get it done and how do we problem solve that? And it all comes down to this, the bee you get in your bonnet on the story that you need to tell, and so I, I think that we've done a good job of making that happen. And I think this scene that you just showed is a good example as well, because, you know, um, it's not a secret. It's not my favorite part of the film. Putting it together was, a lot of work, but it was also fun. I like those challenges. That's not a bad thing to have challenges. It keeps us invested and engaged, and we learn. So I'm all on board for that. But I think one of the funniest little side stories that I'll share is, of course, the Furies are speaking in ancient Greek. So we had to find an expert who could teach our actresses how to speak in ancient Greek and how to interpret that text and that script. And we put it all out there. And I think they, man, they were really good sports with all that goo and, trying to get out there and read those lines and perform those lines. And then the distributor had a snafu and didn't put subtitles in, which
I
I thought
know.
was so funny because, I mean, we couldn't even tell what they were saying. So that was one of my favorite little
Yeah,
secrets.
yeah.
That
Well,
scene.
I was really convinced that people would have. I mean, it is that opening sequence was a major risk. I mean, not just the ancient Greek part of it, but everything about it, because it is a completely. I mean, it's a scene of what Hitchcock actually would call pure cinema. It's not. There's no explanation. It is completely visceral and is completely felt. But to me, again, that goes back to this idea of the unconscious. I wanted to establish that idea, and to go back to this idea of questions. The one question that I wanted to plant in the mind of the audience by sort of using a cinematic language that was clearly referencing, the original Alien, is what is the connection between Alien and the Furies of Greek mythology. And that is the question that is essentially answered over the course of the film, right? And so the risk was um, to take the audience to ancient Greece from the beginning on a film about Alien. But that's the risk we took. I'm really glad that we did. I'm proud of it. And I was expecting that every single Q&A at festivals would be, what the hell? What was that opening sequence? Like, I didn't get it. And strangely enough, the reaction was exactly the opposite. It took I think about 9 months of touring with that film for finally someone to ask that question. People have connected with that opening sequence. So anyway, so and then the last thing I want to say, because we've been talking a lot longer, I think, than we were supposed to. But and obviously you have to do, you have your masterclass as well. But to piggyback on what you were saying earlier, that we've been working now for 15 years together. I think for all the filmmakers, out there, I mean, every writer director should be so lucky to have a producer as great as Carrie. I will say that. No, it's true. I mean it. We butt heads a lot. I'll say that, and that's okay. But it's really important for you guys, I think, as you're building as you're developing your voice, as you're building your brand, your company, to surround yourself with people who are, who work well with you, who are not going to give you, who are not going to say yes when you want them to say yes, when in fact they should be saying no, who should be pushing back, who should be challenging you, who should be pushing you, and whom you trust. And I think that's, because those relationships, and I think it's not just you, Carrie, but obviously I feel like we've been very fortunate with our entire team. The people that we have taken as part of our filmmaking family, the moment they're in, they stay, and they stay forever, right? It's like The Shining, they stay forever and ever, right? But I think that's, filmmaking is so hard that, and there's so much going on around the buzz and the hype and the premieres and the distributors and the sales agents and all the people who try to take advantage of you, that I think the key that I see, as I see it, of longevity in filmmaking is not just having stories to tell and obviously wanting to get better, and obviously you have to have the fire and you have to want to tell the stories, and it has to be relentless, but it's the people that you work with and stay with and grow with and tell those stories with. And I think that's really the key.
I think so too, Alexander, and thank you for that, by the way. But I think part of it goes back to what you said at the very beginning of this class. I'm going to help you bookend this with structure. It's that intuition. You know what you need, and I know how that can happen with the tools that we have. And Robert knows how to, bring that to life visually. And David and Chad and Dave.
Robert is our cinematographer, by the way. For
what's that?
Robert, I have to say, Robert is our cinematographer, because I don't think people know Robert. No.
Exactly. So, and that's part of the push and the pull, and again, all of us trusting our own guts and fighting for what we believe in, and then this is the most important part, hearing each other. And that's something that you do extraordinarily well. I'm always amazed because Alexander puts so much of his heart into these stories and these projects, and he's almost, to the level of obsession. You watched The Exorcist 30 days in a row for Leap of Faith. Right. So he really just, sits in it and really, really feels it and lives it and tries to impart that in the story. And then if he'll show something and I'll say, I don't like that, or that didn't work, or, instead of going, he goes, okay, let's talk through that. Let's work. So part of, I think, your tremendous talent and gift and success is the ability to take feedback as well, and then put it into yourself and put it back out in a way that makes it better and better. So I think that's part of this process.
Yeah, and the whole process makes it better. And ultimately, I mean, there are, at the end of the day, there will be disagreements that I mean, there are times when we talk about something, and then eventually I'll say, Carrie, I hear you, but I'm going to have to go in that direction. And I think that's the other thing too. Then this is what I will leave this class with, is this idea that when you have finished a film and you are up on stage in front of the audience and people ask you questions, I think the most important thing as a director or writer director is that you have to be very clear on the creative choices that you've made and why you've made them. And you have to be very clear on the fact that not everybody will agree. That some people will dislike your film, and that's okay. You're never going to please everybody. But then when people raise their hand and question your choices, you need to be clear on why you did it this way and not in that other way, right? And say, I respect your opinion. I see where you're coming from or whatever, but this is the story that I needed to tell, and I needed to tell it in this particular way, and this is why. And if you're comfortable with that, then you're comfortable with your film. And if you're comfortable with your film, then the rest really, I think, should unfold reasonably well. I'll say that. There's always all kinds of, releasing a film is always, you never know what's going to happen, right? But I think to have that clarity of intent and purpose, that's really the best position to be in. And I think at the end of the day, that's what filmmaking is all about. you know. So I think we have many more stories to tell. Clearly, we're making more and more, and I feel like, you know, maybe there'll be one day when we don't, and that's okay. But until then, BIFAN, we will see you. All right, thank you very much, everybody, and thank you, Carrie, and thank you, BIFAN, and we will see you at the next masterclass.